joining us today, but she sends her love and can't wait to see how truly academic her husband can be. Sadly, however, as stated earlier, I will fail. Just as all men attempting to see the Dark Tower have. We entertained on our honeymoon in the hills and mountains of Colorado, such a beautiful destination, however, burdened by fire restrictions, as we see now currently the coast of California burns. This desolate area of canyons and desert terraformed reverts back to its ugly truth. Everything in nature ignoble shall burn or be left with no God. As a man who enjoys especially a good fire when camping, we were denied this at times as to not set Colorado aflame, the way the Golden State burns today. After an endearing ceremony with family, we set out into the wilderness to camp and consummate our new marriage. We drove on the tops of mountains, on Trail Ridge Road, and descended on Grand Lake, where just enough rain had been available the day before to let us start a fire. I constructed our wood into the pit, lit the pyre, only to find green, purple, and pink flames. To make me question, in fact, was I hallucinating? First thing I thought was, wow, this legal Colorado marijuana is truly something else. I looked over to my new wife and asked, is it just me, or are we crossed over to Oz? Are these flames truly green? She laughed and said yes. I knew then that this was not your average campfire. This was a sign that we had stumbled upon the light electric, summoning the spirits of the gods, apparitions, demons, lunacy, something. Why were the flames so many colors? I pulled a bottle of whiskey and just stared long and hard into the spectacle and held my wife closely to my side. For what else was one to do as we enjoyed tincture and the spirits around us and passed out into slumber? We woke into the morning and went back to the office of the campground. I queried the lady as if there was anything funny going on with the wood. She would go on to admit that as part of our honeymoon gift, she had given us some firewood sprinkled with mystical fire. A chemical additive, I would find out, that changed the color of the flames. I began to think that this was a lifestyle or a cult campground that I was not fully prepared for. So we bought a few trinkets and hopped in the car to our next destination, which was the Cripple Creek Campground, KOA. Now, Cripple Creek was an old mining town high in the mountains, off the highway. And as such, there was no fire allowed, but plenty of gambling and firewater, somehow once again missing the ban. As we began to fall asleep that night, I made my way to the facilities, and I noticed there was a little lending library where one could leave a book, take a book as is customary in hotels and travel places that they have. I scanned the title, and this is the book that caught my eye. I pulled it from the Cripple Creek Campground, Stephen King's The Dark Tower. The Gunslinger, apparently a #1 bestseller from 1982. My first thought was, he lied in every word. That hoary Cripple Creek Campground with malicious eye, askance to watch the working of his lie on mine. And so began my relationship with not only this book, but the poem that would inspire it. Robert Browning's Thus Childe Roland to the Dark Tower came. As your president of the New York Browning Society, I suddenly realized that my personal journey to the Dark Tower had just begun. The poem, which I had not really fully read at that time, began to creep within my dreams, and I made the decision to research the subject that led Mr. King to sell so many books and a feature-length Hollywood movie with the same title. So let's start with the basics. What is the origin of Browning's poem, and how did it come to inspire a multi-million-dollar industry? Well, it all started as every great relationship does, with men and women. I'm glad to be a fully functioning member. Men and Women is a collection of 51 poems in 2 volumes, first published in 1855 by Robert Browning. Well, now generally considered to contain some of the best of Browning's poetry, at the time it was not received well and sold poorly. Men and Women was Browning's first published work after a 5-year hiatus, and his first collection of shorter poems since his marriage to Elizabeth Barrett Browning. in 1846. His reputation had still not fully recovered from the disastrous failure of Sordello 15 years previously, and Browning was at the time comprehensively overshadowed by his wife in terms of both critical reception and commercial success. Away from the spotlight, Browning was able to work on a long-considered project. He had long been associated with the dramatic monologue, having written 2 early volumes of poems entitled Dramatic Lyrics and Dramatic Romance and Lyrics, but with Men and Women, he took the concept a step further. Browning's Men and Women consists of 51 poems, all of which are monologues spoken by different narrators, some identified and some not. The first 50 take in a very diverse range of historical, religious, or European situations, with the 51st, One Word More, featuring Browning himself as narrator and dedicated to his wife. The title of the collection came from a line in her sonnets from the Portuguese. Browning himself was very fond of the collection, referring to the poems as my 50 men and women, from the opening line in One Word More. And today, Men and Women has been described as one of Victoria, England's most significant books. Among the titles were such poetical hits as Love Among the Ruins, A Woman's Last Word, Fra Lippo Lippi, A Toccata of Galuppi's, A Serenade at the Villa, My Star, Childe Roland, obviously, To the Dark Tower Came, Love in a Life, Life in a Love, Andrea del Sarto, Before, After, In 3 Days, Two in the Campagna, A Grammarian's Funeral, Another Way of Love, and One Word More. Now, as you can see, this is quite the powerhouse collection. Childe Roland is a gem, but it almost doesn't quite fit this collection per se, and it's been regarded as a mysterious poem with many countless interpretations. When you're referencing the Wikipedia page, you will see that it has the origin story for the poem as thus. The title, Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came, which forms the last words of the poem, is a line from William Shakespeare's play King Lear. In the play, Gloucester's son, Edgar, leads credence to his disguise as Tom of Bedlam by talking nonsense, of which this is the part. Childe Roland to the Dark Tower came, his words were still, fee-fo-fum, I smell the blood of a British man. Shakespeare took his inspiration from the fairy tale of Scottish origin, the Childe Roland. Now, the name Roland is references to a slughorn at the very end, the very last line, which is a pseudo-medieval instrument, which never existed in the mind of anybody but Thomas Chatterton, a poet that made up his historical battles through poetry in a general medieval setting. And the title Child, a medieval term not for child but as an untested knight, suggests that the protagonist is the paladin of the Song of Roland, the 11th century anonymous French chanson de geste, amongst other works. The poem opens with Roland's speculation about the truthfulness of the man who gives his directions to the Dark Tower. Browning does not retell the Song of Roland. His starting point is Shakespeare. The gloomy, cynical Roland seeks the tower and undergoes various hardships on the way, although most of the obstacles arise from his own imagination. Once reached the tower, Roland finds all those who failed to reach the tower, and under it he finally, about Childe Roland and the Dark Tower came, what Roland finds inside the tower is not revealed. Now, we all know that Wikipedia is by all means not the most accurate of sources, but it intrigued me that its origins could have come from Shakespeare's King Lear, one of the earliest French poems, and an old Scottish ballad. As I had stated earlier, I will fail in this lecture, for none of these things are true. I must attest, and thus a Victorian age fake news. I totally understand when reading the synopsis from the newsletter from the amazing Laura Clark that you might feel that your first thought thus must be, he lied in every word. I don't blame you, but I'm glad to set the record straight that I will indeed point you on the proper path to the Dark Tower. Whether we make it or not, there are absolutely no connections between King Lear, the Scottish ballad, or the French poem that made this poem possible. Robert Browning clearly states that this poem came to him in a dream. And no matter how many articles or scholarly journals, as our Vice President Robert Kramer purports, just tired academics looking for a promotion. This poem is no more influenced or inspired by than the original. It's influenced and inspired by the original thoughts and ideas that culminated in a dream that Robert had and led him to write this unique and original vision in one sitting once he woke up, after literally waking up from hell. And one hell of an apocalyptic dream it is. So, taking away its purported influences, establishing the poem as an original modern creation only leads to the credence of how many pieces of work it has, however, directly influenced. This list, for sure, resonates solely with the source material and has greatly impacted the world of literature over with its undertones and languid accounts of Childe Roland's experiences as he takes on the task of locating the Dark Tower. Here is a list of all that it has directly influenced. Obviously, the Stephen King and the Dark Tower series. African-American author and poet County Cullen from The Dark Tower, a poem written in 1927. American author Alexander Thoreau based his story Childe Roland in Three Wogs in 1972 on Browning's poem. Welsh science fiction author Alastair Reynolds for The Diamond Dogs, a novella in 2001. Canadian science fiction author George R. Dixon for his Child Cycle, series of novels 1959 to 2001. American science fiction author Andre Norton for the fourth novel in her Witch World series. Isidore by English writer Alan Garner. Louise Berridge claims that Childe Roland was the inspiration for the main character in her Chevalier series of novels. The Doctor Who 20th anniversary special, The Five Doctors, takes much imagery and several key phrases from the poem, which has been cited as a source by screenwriter Terrence Dicks. And it goes on and on. In all honesty, I could read the entire list. There's some highlights. Neil Gaiman's Sandman character, Charles Roland, one of the Dead Boy detectives, is a reference to Childe Roland, particularly by the Children's Crusade. The Harry Potter series, the Slughorn character, Ghost at a Watchman by Harper Lee, the song Dark Tower by progressive metal band Sky Empire is based in large part by the Childe Roland. So as you can see, this list is massive, and it continues to grow. In fact, in researching this, I came across a great article from the Library of Congress that not only used King's Dark Tower to link back to Browning, but also to our dear Browning societies and our friend and many times speaker here, Heidi Jawad. This is from the Library of Congress. How did Stephen King to the Dark Tower come? Through Robert Browning's Childe Roland. Browning's 34 stanza narrative poem takes its title from part of a song by Edgar, which is also, once again, established Victorian fake news. In the poem, the narrator, presumably Childe Roland himself, approaches the end of a years-long quest and search for the Dark Tower, traversing a grotesque, nightmarish landscape and remembering knights who had gone before him and failed in their quest. The narrator finally arrives at the round, squat turret that is the Dark Tower and blows his horn, bringing the poem to close on an ambiguous note. Now, Stephen King recounts the role played by Childe Roland, which he first read in 1967 for a class assignment while at the University of Maine, in formulating the central imagery and concept for the Dark Tower books. He states, "The idea of writing this dark fantasy series came from a favorite poem. Robert Browning's Childe Roland to the Dark Tower came. King quickly warms to his story. Browning never says what that tower is, but it's based on an even older tradition about Childe Roland that's lost in antiquity. Nobody knows who wrote it, and nobody knows what the Dark Tower is. So I started off wondering, what is the tower? What does it mean? And I decided that everybody keeps a dark tower in their heart that they want to find. They know it's destructive. It'll probably mean the end of them, but there's that urge to make it your own, to destroy it, one or the other, so I thought maybe it's a different thing to different people, and as I write along, I'll find out what it is to Roland, and I find that out, but I'm not going to tell you." So, Stephen King has his own fantasies, clearly. Now, there's been a lot of, the main character of the book is entitled Roland Child. I guess I'll speak towards this book, just haphazardly. So I picked up this book in Cripple Creek, and I started to read it. This is my first Stephen King novel. I don't know if anyone's really familiar with the author. He's a best-selling author. He's written many books and has been a part of a lot of movies. Now, I'm a big fan of literature, and I had a hard time getting through this, to be honest. I had a really hard time. and unlike Childe Roland, I gave up about that far in. No disrespect to Stephen King, but if you haven't read his work, I don't know how to explain it, but the way that he puts words together is very interesting and unique, and I'm sure that because he sells a lot of books that it really resonates with a lot of people, and I went down the wrong path in this particular novel. I can't wait till this is over so I can start another book. Now, readers and scholars' fascination with Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came extends back to Browning's lifetime, when, as Heidi Jawad notes in his book Browning Mania, America's Love for Robert Browning, who he did a lecture about this book when it came out here at the National Honors Club, Browning's poetry was celebrated and passionately scrutinized around the land, more intensely in America, in fact, than his own native England. Jawad coins the term Browning Mania to describe the intense fan frenzy directed towards Browning, especially in America, which held sway in the United States well after the poet's death in 1889 and continued unabated past the 1912 centennial of his birth, an event celebrated with ceremonial pomp across the country. Now, one of the symptoms of Browning mania was the proliferation of Browning societies in cities and towns across the United States dedicated to the reading, study, and performance of Browning's poetry and marked by general admiration of Browning's life and that of his wife, poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who died in 1861. Jawad writes that practically any American town with an aspiration to high culture had its own Browning society. By the 1900s, the number of such societies across the nation exceeded 900 by some accounts. Now, while Browning's poetry was regularly studied and discussed by members of the Browning societies, poems such as Childe Roland that were perceived to have an allegorical meaning, Browning himself said that he was conscious of no allegorical intention in writing it, were particularly susceptible to detailed interpretations. For example, this is very interesting, a search of historical newspaper databases chronicling America reveals a number of instances in which Browning societies and enthusiasts held Childe Roland events. There's at least 12 here. And just to give one example, across from an announcement for a November 21st meeting of the Browning Club focused on Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came, which is described as probably the most talked about work of the poet. And you can see they even have the old newspaper articles. This particular article is from the Browning Club, has an interesting subject from the Pensacola Journal, November 12, 1908. At the next meeting of the Browning Club, November 21st, funny it's a November meeting as well, the subject of discussion will be the dramatic poem Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came. This is one of the most wonderful poems in the English language. We have the authority of Mr. Browning himself that the poem is not an allegory, but dramatic incident based on a line from Shakespeare. That's fake news. Yet its vivid imagery, its profound exposition of his life have proved so great a stimulus to the imagination that it is probably the most talked of work of the poet. The central thought of the poem will be the basis of the discussion, and it is expected that each member will have determined this for herself before, I like how it's herself, right? Have determined this for herself, because all the Browning societies were women up until 1982, before the meeting, recalling the remark of Professor Moulton that in the study of literature or art in any form, the meaning is what it means to you. The leader of the club has requested members to number each stanza in their books for purposes of ready reference. Now, this was back in a time when you could have a study reference and say, everybody read the poem, and then we could just reference the stanzas. It's a whole nother, it's almost like, because the membership was all women for the majority of at least here at the New York Browning Society that I can document, is that this was kind of like a university for women. This was their way of extending their academic learning to participating in public events and discussing and developing ideas around great works of literature that they were denied through being able to go to universities or in the public sphere. So this was really a unique situation for women to really, empower themselves through these intellectual discourses. Now, a month later, H.C. Edgar, an instructor at the Browning Club, published a detailed interpretation of the poem. In Edgar's analysis, which may have emerged out of discussions of the poem held at the previous month's meeting of the Browning Club, Poe offers a rather confident assessment that Childe Roland achieves a moral victory at the end of the poem, despite acknowledging in the article's opening sentence that the great disparity between the many interpretations offered for this poem would seem to indicate that it does not furnish enough data to form an adequate basis for any very definitive specific interpretation. Next we have the Childe Roland H.C. Edgar Instructor at Browning Club newspaper article in which he is announcing his talk. He says, "The great disparity between the many interpretations offered for this poem would seem to indicate that it does not furnish enough data to form an adequate basis for any definitive specific interpretation. It is by no means unlikely that the poem is merely a mystical allegory incapable of a precise translation into literal terms, but was written only to shadow forth certain emotions which by their very nature are inexpressible." Browning himself, in addition to stating the poem had no allegorical meaning, shied away from offering readers his own interpretation of the poem. The closest he came to offering or confirming the specific reading of the poem occurred when fielding a question from a visitor, as recounted in the Browning Cyclopedia, because there is a Browning Cyclopedia, published in 1892. Indeed, when the Reverend John W. Chadwick visited the poet and asked him if constancy to an ideal, "He that endureth to the end shall be saved," was not a sufficient understanding of the central purpose of the poem, Robert Browning said, "Yes, just about that." While analyzing Childe Roland for its allegorical hidden meaning could be a favorite activity of Browning societies, some dismiss Browning societies as being little more than incubators for members' excessive exegetical activities, as conveyed by the following anecdote on March 28, 1891 issue of the Salt Lake Herald, which is entitled, "What Indeed?" An amazing anecdote is related to Robert Browning as regards the uses of Browning societies. A society had met, and the passage under discussion was taken from Childe Roland to the Dark Tower came. The passage was most obscure, and each side waxed warm in advocating their own view. To calm the storm, the president of the society gave notice that he would write to Mr. Browning himself. At the next meeting, amid the great excitement, the president announced that he had received the following reply: "I could certainly explain the passage, but then what would be the use of the Browning Society?" Robert Browning. This was in 1891, yeah. So not every Browning fan before the mid-20th century felt the need to parse his poetry. In a September 6, 1902 laudatory letter to Martha Baker Dunn, who the previous month had written an article on Browning for the Atlantic Monthly, President Theodore Roosevelt described his reasons for liking the poem. "I don't care a rap what the inner meaning of Childe Roland is. What I care about is the lift, the thrill the poem gives, the look of the desolate country, the dauntless bearing of the night, and the strange thoughts and sights, and the squat blind tower itself." This is coming from a sitting president. Regardless of one's reason for liking the poem, Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came has been an object of fascination for generations of Browning's fans and a source of inspiration to Stephen King and others. The poem, no doubt, will continue to surface in literary texts and popular culture for time and continuum. So, to be fairly frank, I started out on this journey much like our hero, Childe Roland. I had no concept of how far the rabbit's hole would go, and the more I researched, the more I realized how deep a meaning this poem had resonated with Browning fans and the general culture of the time. In fact, I must have stumbled through no less than 30 papers, analysis, summaries, discussions, and study courses on the poem. It would have been easy enough to retread a lot of the themes in this analysis, but I found through this whole experience that the poem itself was by far the most interesting and that a lot of the connections being made were just exercises in academic chicanery to make one sound like they had done all the hard lifting in research, but made no tangible or hard evidence to support the linkage other than referencing other documents as proof, but with no explanation given. It seems that many have, and trust me, I am in but a very long line of people, especially presidents of the Browning Societies, to broach this topic. Many have searched long and hard to find some connection and have yet fallen by the wayside. They didn't even make it to the start of the poem and judge for themselves if what the hoary cripple said was true. And as such, in my personal journey, that started with a found tome in Cripple Creek. We shall start where everyone is dropped in on, the titular begin. And let's go to the poem text, follow step by step over our hero, Childe Roland. The first 3 stanzas of the poem. We're going to read this poem, crazy as that sounds. My first thought was he lied in every word, that hoary cripple. What's that? Can you hear me? My first thought was that he lied in every word, that hoary cripple, with malicious eye askance to watch the working of his lie on mine, and mouth scarce able to afford suppression of the glee that pursed and scored its edge at one more victim gained thereby. What else should he be set for with his staff? What save to waylay with his lies and snare all travelers who might find him posted there and ask the road? I guessed what skull-like laugh would break, what crutched gin write my epitaph for pastime in the dusty thoroughfare, if at his counsel I should turn aside into the ominous track which all agree hides the dark tower. Yet acquiescingly I did turn as he pointed, neither pride nor hope rekindling at the end decried, so much as gladness that some end might be. Now, in the first stanza, we meet our hoary-eyed cripple guide, who Roland clearly does not believe from the get-go. Now, what this lie he supposed was is not 100% clear. But I would say it's merely him given to this point that the old man was not who he said he was, and that he was merely trying to ensnare those gullible enough to ask the question. He describes how he looks upon Roland waiting to see if he has been hooked with his story, trying to hold in his evil laugh that pursed and scored its edge. And in stanza 2, he begins to question thus, what would this man be doing here in the first place? He imagines that with his crutch, that he would be beginning to write his epitaph, though he would be taking his crutch and writing it into the dirt of the road, Roland's epitaph. So in stanza 3, we see that he gives up his paranoia completely to a certain extent in his knowledge at which all agree that in fact there was a large tract of land that hid the dark tower. And accepting his fate that the cripple was telling the truth, a sense of gladness that the end of his search for the path had come. Now the next 2 stanzas. For what with my whole world-wide wandering, what with my search drawn out through years, my hope dwindled into a ghost not fit to cope with the obstreperous joy success would bring, I hardly tried not now to rebuke the spring my heart made, finding failure in its scope. As when a sick man, very near to death, seems dead indeed, and feels begin and end the tears, and takes the farewell of each friend, and hears one bid the other go, draw breath freelier outside, since all is o'er, he saith, and the blow fallen no grieving can amend. Now, stanza 4 mirrors my quest almost to a T. I couldn't help but compose the whole world-wide wandering to my own whole world-wide web search for the influences of this poem. But as you can see that just to get to this point, our Childe Roland has spent a great many years just to get to the cripple, or as we say, wholly physically challenged in our current PC culture. But we can stay in the medieval for this lecture. So it has waned upon his own sanity and moral fiber, dwindling down into even a ghost of himself, as he says. So you can see this sort of interior battle, one with the initial hesitation and trusting the old man, and then two, the sort of relent that in fact he may have finally reached a place that he had kind of given up on throughout his years and years of searching. Now, with the supposed noisy or hurrah that success would typically bring, you don't get that here. And in fact, he truly hasn't accomplished anything, but as what he now believes is the path to the dark tower, or has started to believe. I love how it says, I hardly tried now to rebuke the spring my heart made, finding failures in its scope. His heart thus is reborn in this idea, but he still finds failure, but doesn't have it in him to fight and accept his fate, as the next stanza illustrates, as when a sick man very, very near death seems dead indeed, since all is over washes over him. Now, the next two stanzas are actually kind of humorous, as they describe the whole state of death. The first stanza, let's see. The first stanza is, as for the, all right, one more, there we go. Well, some discuss if near the other graves be room enough for this, and when a day suits best for carrying the corpse away, with care about the banners, scarves, staves, and still the man hears all, and only craves he may not shame such tender love, and stay. Thus I had so long suffered in this quest, heard failure prophesied so oft, been writ so many times amongst the band, to wit, the knights who to the dark tower search addressed, their steps that just to fail as they seem best, and all the doubt was now, should I be fit? Now I love sort of the ironic way Browning phrases that last line. And still the man hears all, and only craves he may not shame such tender love and stay. So people are talking about, how to get rid of the body, how we're going to plan for the funeral, if this man is completely dying, and it's sort of this sort of ironic way of saying, for all this tender love that they have for me, maybe I'll just stay, as you can hear them talking about that, planning his funeral. Now the next stanza sets us up for the plot of the journey, which we see that, let's see here. We see that a band of knights have also been searching for the Dark Tower. From the line, who we all agree, but that even with the whole band of knights, not one has been successful. In fact, no one has presumably made even now as far as Childe Roland has. And yet he asks, and all the doubt was now, should I be fit? As if to ask if he was fit enough to fail. This is my premise. I come today with Sir Roland, claiming 100% that I am fit to fail, whereas Roland still has his doubts. I do not. So, quiet as despair, I turn from him, that hateful cripple, out of his highway. This is the beginning of the descent into the path he pointed. Now, it had been a dreary day at best, and dim was settling to its close, yet shot one grim red Lear to see the plain catch its astray. That complete resolve that lies, or whatever his initial thoughts he was going for, that last glow of red sunset, that way that he phrases the red Lear, was settling to its close, yet shot one grim red Lear, that's line 48, to see the plain catch its astray. This is basically him, Roland, looking at the sunset, getting one last glance of it, and realizing that he is the astray. He is the lost human, or the lost animal on this path, on this plane. So the next lines, 49 through 54, for Mark, no sooner was I fairly found, pledged to the plain, after a pace or two, than pausing to throw backward a last view, o'er the safe road 'twas gone, grey plain all around, nothing but plain to the horizon's bound, I might go on, naught else remained to do. And if you continue to look at actually from 55 to 56 as well, he says, so on I went, I think I never saw such starved, ignoble nature, Nothing throve for flower as well expect a cedar grove, but cockle, spurge, according to their law, might propagate their kind with none to awe. You think a burr had been a treasure trove. So with one look back, the highway and the old man are gone. Our hero Roland has descended into the starved, ignoble nature where nothing throve. The ironic humor being, what were you expecting, a cedar grove? He starts to describe the plants. Now, this is where in most Victorian poetry or in the general questing poetry genre, from what I've experienced, the writer would easily skip over such detail. But Browning, from here on out, will use such great description to make a living character out of the landscape itself, akin to the Ansel Adams of Purgatory. He describes the cockle, the spurge, both weedy plants that take over where no other plants still survive, likening their presence to seeing the painful spiked plant of a burr as a treasure trove. Like that's some sort of amazing, thing to come across. The next stanza actually gives a voice to nature's thoughts on the given subject, and that's from 61 to 66. Penury, inertness, and grimace in some strange sort, where the land's portion, see or shut your eyes, said nature peevishly. It nothing skills, I cannot help my case. 'Tis the last judgment fire must cure this place, calcine its clods and set my prisoners free. Thus, either accept it or shut your eyes. The only prescription for this is the fire of judgment day, to cleanse through fire and set free the miserable prisoners of this cursed earth, supposing the plants and even Roland at this point. I like how nature is just saying, if you don't like it, just shut your eyes. This is all you get, and we need a holy fire to set us free. So you can see that the landscape itself is sort of a detrimental. There's nothing good. There's nothing to grow. There's nothing ripe. There's nothing to pull. It's all sort of desolate, weedy territory that almost feels, and you're beginning to feel, and you will see later how it almost, the landscape hates itself. Like the landscape is its own character. So from 67 to 72. If there pushed any ragged thistle stalk above its mates, the head was chopped, the bents were jealous else. What made those holes and rents in the dock's harsh swarth leaves, bruised as to balk all hopes of greenness? 'Tis a brute must walk, pashing their life out with a brute's intent. Now, the one plant that I didn't know of right off the bat was the dock. The dock is actually a rumex. It's a perennial herb considered to be a nuisance weed belonging to the buckwheat family. What's funny is that you can eat this weed. And I was just, funny enough, I was watching this movie yesterday called Crocodile Dundee. I don't know if you've ever seen this movie. Well, there's this great line in the movie, and I won't say the expletive, but he says, you could live on it, but it tastes like. So nonetheless, there is no gourmet food but the words Browning uses here to describe the surroundings. Now, the lines 73 to 84, as for the grass, it grew as scant as hair in leprosy. Thin, dry blades pricked the mud, which underneath looked kneaded up with blood. One stiff, blind horse, his every bone a stare, stood stupefied, however he came there, thrust out past service from the devil's stud. Alive? He might be dead for aught I know, with that red gaunt and calloped neck a-strain, and shut eyes underneath the rusty mane. Seldom when such grotesqueness with such woe I never saw a brute. I hated so, he must be wicked to deserve such pain. Now we've met our first animal. What a specimen. Standing on the soil that looks to be kneaded by blood and strewn in patchy leprosy hair, the red skin translucent to the aging bones and the collops of meat that make up his neck. It's like these thin, struggling pieces of flesh underneath of meat underneath the flesh. He must be wicked to deserve such pain. There simply is no empathy for this beast burdened. In fact, hatred was brewed solely by Roland's eyeing of the creature, as if almost he's hating himself. Alive? ? He might be coming more dead inside. As we go to 85, I shut my eyes and turned them on my heart. As a man calls for wine before he fights, I asked one draught of earlier, happier sights. Ere fitly I could hope to play my part, think first, fight afterwards, the soldier's art. One taste of the old times set all to rights. Not it! Not it. I fancied Cuthbert's reddening face beneath its garniture of curly gold. Dear fellow, till I almost felt him fold an arm in mine to fix me to the place that way he used, alas, one night's disgrace. Outwit my heart's new fire and let it cold. Giles, then, the soul of honor, there he stands, frank as 10 years ago when knighted first. What honest man should dare, he said, he durst. Good, but the scene shifts, foul. What hangman hands into his breast a parchment, his own bands read it, poor traitor, spit upon and cursed. Better this present than a past like that. Back therefore to my darkening path. Again, no sound, no sight as far as I could strain. Will the knights into Howlet or a bat? I asked, when something on the dismal flat came to arrest my thoughts and change their train. So as he tries to shut his eyes, he's tired of seeing all this sort of grotesque ugliness, and he's trying to think of better times. He mentions that how one could ask for a glass of wine before he fights. He's trying to get his spirits up to continue on after being so sort of let down by this whole environment around him. And once he's doing it, he closes his eyes, and instead of seeing something happy, we see Cuthbert and Giles. Now, it's with Browning's true ability to create fully fleshed out characters that we are introduced to these fellow Knights of Roland's band. Now, when Roland was trying to think of something to rally his spirits, he comes to the story instead of the failure of two of his brethren, showing a mental descent. His mind is sort of slowly going in to accompany the landscape, and it's in this description of these characters. One could search for connections. Who is Cuthbert? Who is Giles? You could do the research in the literary work, but it seems Cuthbert and Giles, as the entirety of the poem, are all original imaginations of Robert. Now, as you can see, that either Cuthbert or Giles never even got as far as the cripple in this failure for the Dark Tower. So Roland, despite his spiraling doubts, is doing quite well. He comes to terms with this somewhat by his statement, better this present than a past like that, meaning it's better for him to even be surrounded in this situation than to have gone down the path that these people were and were disgraced dishonorably. So he refuses that path for himself, and he goes back to the darkening path. He then realizes that when he opens his eyes, that he's not going to be able to change his mind. The dreary landscape is not going to help him. And he longs for a bird or like an owl, as he says, a howlet, or a bat, or something to take up his attention, just to let him escape for a moment from his own thoughts. His mind is going around in circles, and he needs a way out, and thus, on line 109, a sudden river crossed my path. As unexpected as a serpent comes, no sluggish tide congenial to the glooms. This, as it frothed by might, have been a bath for the fiend's glowing hoof, to see the wrath of its black eddy bespate with flakes and spumes. So petty, yet so spiteful, all along low, scrubby alders kneel down over it, drenched willows flung from headlong in a fit of mute despair, a suicidal throng, the river which had done them all the wrong, whatever that was, rolled by, deterred no whit, which while I forded, good saints, how I feared to set my foot upon a dead man's cheek, each step, or feel the spear I thrust to seek for hollows, tangled in his hair or beard. It may have been a water rat I speared, but ugh, it sounded like a baby's shriek. The river, and boy, what an ominous stick this be. It might have been a bath for the devil himself, Browning mentions. He goes on out of his way to describe the vegetation from the low, scrubby alders. Now, that's a type of river birch that has catkins as flowers, which is kind of like a cylindrical flower, but it looks like a spike. So even the flowers look like, spikes, like they're trying to attack. It's not the most beautiful of tree, but it does survive because of its hardiness. And the suicidal willows in muted despair at the river that has wronged them. So a plant's food for life is water. And their whole existence has been wronged by the froth of this Mephistopheles. Every piece of imagery is hating its own existence and just wanting to die, but it can't. It's kind of like our hero Roland. He crosses the river, he steps on our second animal that's mentioned in this poem, a water rat, in which upon placing his weight upon the drenched, non-flying pigeon, elicits a scream as one had stepped on a baby. It would be truly horrifying alarm tone for your cell phone, and such Roland passes the river. 127, glad was I when I reached the other bank. Now for better country, vain presage. So he's made it. It doesn't look like it. If you continue on, he says, who were the strugglers? What war did they wage? Whose savage trample thus could pad the dank soil to a plash? Toads in a poison tank, or wild cats in a red-hot iron cage? The flight must so have seemed in that fell cirque. What penned them there, with all the plain to choose? No footprint leading to the horrid muse, none out of it. Mad brewage set to work their brains, no doubt like galley slaves the Turk pits for his pastime, Christians against Jews. And more than that, a furlong on, why there? What bad use was that engine for? That wheel or brake, not wheel, that harrow fit to reel men's body out like silk, with all the air of Tophet's tool, on earth left unaware, a brought to sharpen its rusty teeth of steel. I love how as soon as our hero steps onto the other side of the river, he imagines everything would be smooth sailing, greener passages, such vain presage. In fact, the wasteland he steps out to is in the remains of some horrid atrocity, the leftovers of a great battle with no clear victor, but death and struggle, torture and pain like toads going after each other in a poison tank, or wild cats fighting to death in a red-hot iron cage, like rats in a drowning ship, but yet no view of what or who or how any of this has happened. He compares it to Turks giving bad, hopped-up, super crazy drug liquor to his Jew and Christian slaves in the galley to be pit against each other. And then he stares down at a monstrosity, a giant harrow. Now, a harrow is like a machine akin to a plowshare, made to decimate clouds of earth. It's made to destroy whatever it comes in to till the soil, but only like the really, really bad, hard stuff. It can till men's bones. And in this case, the bones of men's bodies like silk, churning their blood into the soil. Browning then references Tophet's tool. Now, Tophet was a location in Jerusalem, in Gehinnom, 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 where worshippers influenced by the ancient Canaanite religion engaged in the human sacrifice of children to the gods Moloch and Baal by burning them alive. Tophet became a theological or poetic synonym for hell within Christendom. The traditional explanation that a burning rubbish heap in the valley of Hinnom, south of Jerusalem, gave rise to the idea of fiery Gehenna of judgment and is attributed to Rabbi David Kimmel's commentary on Psalm 27:13. He maintained that in the loathsome valley, fires were kept burning perpetually to consume the filth and cadavers thrown into it. As you can tell, this is really not a nice place to be. If you follow the history of the dead bodies of the people shall be the food for the birds of the sky, for the animals of the earth, and none shall frighten them away. Then will I call to cease from the cities of Judah and from the streets of Jerusalem the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, for land shall become a waste. This is all an apocalyptic scenario where you see the bodies constantly either being eaten by the never-ending worms or being consumed by the never-ending fire. Either way, it's not the most joyous of landscapes to behold. So this obviously points our scenery as a 5-star review for the 7th circle of Dante's Inferno. The next line is 145th. Then came a bit of stub ground. Once a wood, next a march, it would seem, and now more earth desperate and done with. So a fool finds mirth, makes a thing, and then mars it, till his mood changes, and off he goes, within a rude bog, clay and rubble, sand and stark black dearth. Now blotches, rankling, colored gray and grim, now patches where some leanness of the soils broke into moss or substance like boils. Then came some palsied oak, a cleft in him, like a distorted mouth that splits its rim, gaping at death and dies while it recoils. Like some insane god or petulant child who has created something and then mars it. We go from wood to mangled marsh, an acre of bog, clay, rubble, sand, stark black dearth. Welcome to the void. This diseased soil rankling with boils, a moss of sickness becoming a carpet under which Roland's foot as he stares into the gnarled and split paralyzed oak tree, a gaping distorted mouth that dies while it recoils. And the next line is, and just as far as ever from the end, which I love how that is. So, and this stanza starts out, and just as far as ever from the end, not in the distance, but the evening, not to point my footstep further, at the thought a great black bird, Apollyon's bosom friend, sailed past, nor beat his wide-winged dragon pen that brushed my cap, perchance the guide I sought. For looking up, away, I somehow grew, spite of the dusk, the plain had given place all round to mountains, with such name to grace, mere ugly heights and heaps now stolen in view, how thus they had surprised me. Solve it, you. How to get from them was no clearer case, yet half I seemed to recognize some trick of mischief happened to me, God knows when, in a bad dream perhaps. Here ended then progress this way, when in the very nick of giving up, one time more came a click, and when a trap shuts, you're inside the den. So, with no end in sight, our hero Roland has no idea where to go until a great black bird, a bosom buddy of Apollyon. Now, Apollyon is Greek for Abaddon. It's appears in the Bible as both a place of destruction and an angel of the abyss. In the Hebrew Bible, Abaddon is used with reference to a bottomless pit, often appearing alongside the place Sheol, meaning the realm of the dead. In the New Testament book of Revelation, an angel called Abaddon is described as the king of an army of locusts. His name is first transcribed in Greek, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, the angel of death. The Latin Vulgate and the Douay-Rheims Bible have additional notes not present in the Greek text. In Latin, extremis mean the Latin word for the destroyer. So this is his best buddy, this bird. And this dragon destroyer, death bird, swings down and nudges Roland's hat. Just kind of gives him a little tap on the head. He looks up for the first time thinking, well, this may be his guide. And in fact, it is. Because for the length of the poem, since he left the track, he's been focusing on the grisly flora and fauna and his own self-doubt. He looks up for the first time, all of a sudden, and sees the mountains. How he has wandered into the mountains, he has no idea. He says, solve it, you. As if he had been under an enchantment, staring at mystical fire, watching the flames turn green, purple, and pink, to be distracted from his true surroundings. In this bad dream, like Browning's, he realizes he has been strung into a trap. There is no more progress. Out of all the travails to wake up and realize it's over. 175. Burningly, it came on me all at once. This was the place. Those two hills on the right, crouched like two bulls locked horn in fight, while to the left a tall scalped mountain, dunce, dotard, a dozing at the very nonce, after a life spent training for the sight. Like an idiot, a dotard dazing at the very moment he had been awaiting for, does he thus reach the dark tower. 181 goes on. What in the midst lay but the tower itself, the round squat turret, blind as the fool's heart, built of brown stone without a counterpart in the whole world? The tempest-mocking elf points to the shipman, thus the unseen shelf he strikes on only when the timbers start. Not see? Because of night, perhaps? Why day? Came back again for that. Before it left, the dying sunset kindled through a cleft. The hills, like giants at a hunting, lay chin upon hand to see the game at bay, now stab and end the creature to the heft. We gaze upon a small turret, with no windows, no counterpart, the dark tower. He still does not know, dear Roland, how he has gotten there. The illusion of the spirit in the storm, mocking the sea captain when the ship has already hit the rocks and begins to sink. He wakes into the bowl of the mountains like hunting giants watching their little gerbil in the wheel. He waits for them to end his life before he can truly realize that he has attained the prize. 193. Not here. When noise was everywhere, it tolled increasingly like a bell, names in my ear of all the lost adventurers, my peers, how such a one was strong, and such was bold, and such was fortunate, yet each of old lost. One moment knelled the woe of years. There they stood, ranged along the hillsides, met to view the last of me. A living frame, for one more picture. In a sheet of flame I saw them, and I knew them all, and yet dauntless the slughorn to my lips I set, and blew, Childe Roland to the tower came. He is surrounded in his mind of all those that have failed. He sees them how strong, how bold, but lost, all of them. And he stands alone on the tower, while as a glowing vision to the dead he appears a living flame. He knows he's being watched, and all alone he picks up that trusty Chatterton slughorn, and blew Childe Roland to the dark tower came. Now, notice the past tense, as if this was only the start of his future journeys. And it is. As mentioned before, it is inspired in the hearts of men the whole world wide over to continue his journey. Whether it's through his characters' names or the journey to the tower or the tower itself, that last stanza, there they stood, ranged along the hillsides, met to view that last of me, a living frame. For one more picture in a sheet of flame, I saw them and I knew them all, and yet dauntless the slughorn to my lips I set, and blew Childe Roland to the dark tower came. It shows without a doubt that amidst all watching, he in fact found some way to claim the tower. Childe Roland, all his own. Now, when I started this lecture, I stated that I would fail. I have, absolutely. But in that failure, I have stumbled upon something much greater. What Childe Roland woke up to, the dark tower, a seemingly unimportant turret that no one had reached, right before Sleep in the Mountains, a hoary cripple creek guided me to this tome, the Gunslinger. And with that, bore this notion for today's talk. Just like Childe Roland, I have realized that the prize, once captured, is no longer as meaningful as the way in which you have arrived there was. Roland was never in any danger. The worst case is a bite from the drowning river rat. But amidst so much ugliness, so much despair all around him, his self-doubts, his questioning of his own ability, blind or stupid, he kept forward. Simply forward, and stumbled into his goal. When we look around today at the media violence, war, natural disasters, toxic negativity, relentless poverty, and destitution, we can imagine what Browning dreamed up for Roland. And the lesson we can import is no matter how dire circumstances or situations appear, Browning, amidst all the noise, quietly urges us onward to our own accomplishments. For nothing will truly hurt you but your own self. No matter how ugly or beautiful the surroundings, keep going. For to stop is to plan your own demise and simply sink into the wasteland, a prisoner of your own nature, a stagnant, disregarded member of the landscape, or a forgotten felled warrior lost and done out way before you ever ascertained the right path. The influence of this poem has already made major motion pictures, best-selling books, award-winning plays and poems, songs, and art. The question thus becomes, can you fail long enough to continue forward, create your own influence as you stand alone on that dark tower and dauntlessly bring that trusty slug horn to lip and blow? Browning, in one of his finest dreams, wishes this for you, for Childe Roland to the dark tower came. Thank you. I got a little teary-eyed at the end there. My motivational. So we'll open it up for questions. I know, it's a huge piece.
The newsletter talked about this all being in a medieval setting.
Absolutely.
What specifically makes it medieval? I found that the setting is kind of universal.
Well, that's what resonated to me, is that it seems definitely modern in a lot of ways, but the idea of the knights and the idea of the quest and the journey and the tower itself being sort of a medieval fortification for defense, it just kind of places the landscape into that sort of genre, but by no means is it held strictly to that. No, I don't believe so at all. It actually feels very modern to me in reading it.
Just depends on what pictures you come up with your head.
Absolutely, and see, Browning gives you a huge leeway to do that. I mean, there's so many times. I mean, just in developing this and going through this poem, I spent hours and hours on the phone with Robert Kramer, just going line by line on both our interpretations or ideas of what this word means. There's a lot of languages that's old and archaic, and the way that Browning sort of puts things in different directions kind of influences. So it gives a lot of leeway for you to kind of come up with your own ideas, which is kind of, exhilarating, as Theodore Roosevelt would say.
I can't remember the poet, but I do remember the lines. I am wounded, but I am not slain. I will lie me down a while and bleed, and then I'll rise to fight again. To me, that was the undertone
Of the piece.
of Roland's quest.
What I